problem in society we have at the moment is everyone is afraid of making a mistake.
What may happen if we don't do anything?
The pandemic has changed life as we know it. But what comes next? Will our fast-paced lives pick up again? Will we continue to innovate, regardless of the cost? Live lives profit-driven and globally connected? Or has this pandemic sparked irrevocable change? How will we live in the future after the pandemic?
Hello and welcome to DW's COVID-19 special. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin. Well, all this week, we're taking a look ahead at life after the pandemic, from what it means for cities to economies, even nutrition. Today, climate change. As the world focuses on getting past the pandemic, the urgency of climate change has taken a bit of a back seat. But slowing global warming could actually be critical for preventing future disease. Scientists warn that a warming planet will provide fertile ground for viruses and other pathogens and introduce disease carriers to new habitats. A German climate activist and author David Nelles has been mapping out some of those dangers. He spoke with us earlier. Take a listen.
Yeah, one example is the tiger mosquito, which spreads the dengue fever and the chikungunya virus. In the past, it lived just in the Southeast Asian regions, but because of climate change, it's warmer here, so the mosquito comes to Europe, and therefore the risk increases to be infected with tropical diseases, even here in Germany or the United Kingdom.
German climate activist and author David Nelles there. Now, for more on this, let's talk with Adil Najam. He's Dean of the Pardee School of Global Affairs at Boston University. Professor Najam, thank you so much for joining us. This connection between changes in wildlife habitat and disease, has the pandemic helped make this clear to normal people and perhaps added some urgency to climate change?
I hope it will. I'm not sure it has. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, I think there was a bit of fear-mongering about how it had come. We were all concerned, worried about, how did it get here? And because we realized that it had transmuted from sort of the zoological system into the human system, there was this concern that maybe we will again sort of start looking at nature as the enemy. But I hope what will happen and is happening, not as much as I would like, but I hope the right message is that we have to live in coexistence with nature, that nature is a huge thing, that nature is what nourishes us. And if we restrict the space of nature, if we restrict the space of biodiversity, then nature will hit back in the ways, for example, that your guest was talking about with dengue, or in the way that we have seen with coronavirus, that in some ways the big lesson is that there is no human health without ecological health, that the two come together.
Let's talk about the management of climate change. Managing the pandemic has required an incredible amount of collective action and sacrifice, which climate change will also require. Based on what you've seen so far from the pandemic, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the fight against climate change?
At this point, I'm neither, but I do hope that we should be very reflective about what has happened. We should try to think about, okay, what just happened? What did we learn about ourselves, about our own behavior? And we should be very concerned. In some ways, this pandemic gives you an early warning, if you will, of what a truly, or a reminder, because we've had these before, what a truly global crisis looks like. We've talked about climate as a crisis possibly in the future, and having this in your face makes you think and should make you think. There are good lessons and there are some disturbing lessons. The disturbing lesson is that this was not a very global moment. Our immediate reaction, especially in the beginning, was closing up, was getting tribal, was building walls, was trying to blame the other, was trying to put things out. Hey, I have too many problems myself. I can't share my ventilators. I can't really give you my masks. If you go back to March of last year, the good lesson, if you want, is the lesson of vaccine development, for example. The lesson of science coming in to help. The lesson of listening to knowledge. And in a way, the choice that we will make will determine the future. In some ways, the sad part is, and this is what is very much like climate change, we sometimes act surprised that the pandemic happened, but there was no surprise in the pandemic. We knew about pandemics. We talked about pandemics. We prepared, or we said we prepared for pandemics. And yet, when it came, we had ignored it so often that we were found totally unprepared. That is exactly the story with climate change.
At the same time,
when climate change happens, no one has the right to feel surprised.
When we look at climate change versus the pandemic has a very specific end. That is, we all get to a certain number of vaccines, we reach herd immunity. With climate change, there's no solid there perhaps. Does that make it more difficult for someone to imagine tackling climate change versus the pandemic?
It might make it more difficult, but it also makes it more urgent. You're exactly right. Climate change does not have a vaccine. Whether it is Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca or whatever, they're not going to come up with a vaccine or a pill that you're going to pop in and climate change will be solved. Yes, there are ways, what's called adaptation. We will have to adapt. And adaptation will not be comfortable, and adaptation will not be cheap. And again, we've learned that in the pandemic. What does adaptation mean? Something bad happens and you adapt to it. You learn to live with it. So you build your buildings higher if sea level is rising. I wear the sweater because it is cold, I'm adapting. But that is exactly, think about what we did with the pandemic. We adapted. We learned how to wear a mask. We learned how to lock ourselves up. We learned how to not meet friends. We learned how to not hug people we love. That is what adaptation is. And the lesson is adaptation is not comfortable.
How much harder will that shift be? Will those adaptations be, especially as we're going from the end of the pandemic to climate change? I get the feeling that not many people are in the mood to talk about personal sacrifice right now, but they'd rather be rewarded for a period in which they feel like they've already sacrificed a lot. So maybe taking more trips, things like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. In a way, I don't want to begrudge them sort of going out and sort of, after having been locked up for a year. But on the other hand, this is why this should be a moment of reflection. This should be a moment of learning, because we've also done so many things right. We have learned good lessons. We have learned the lesson that if you spend $1 in advance to avert a crisis, you will save millions of dollars if the crisis hits. So I think those are the lessons that come. Now, in terms of climate and pandemic in particular, in the beginning, there was a little sort of thought that, okay, we won't be driving as much and we won't be using energy as much and the consumption will go down. I'm not sure that has exactly happened. Maybe it's happened in a few cases. To the extent it has happened, climate strategy should not be locking people up in their homes. And on the other hand, we have found that, we are a consumptive species. We find new ways to consume. We pay other people to come and travel on our behalf and emit carbon on our behalf and develop and drop food at our doorsteps. But we are a smart species. We should learn from this. I hope the biggest lesson we learn is not that we will all become sort of self-sacrificing. I don't think that's how it will solve it. The question is not self-sacrifice. The question is smart behavior. We do not get pleasure out of emitting carbon. We get pleasure out of quality of life. And I hope what the pandemic also teaches us is that quality of life means more than just getting into your car and getting stuck in traffic.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for now. Professor Adil Najam with Boston University, thank you so much for joining us. And let's check in now with our science correspondent, Derek Williams, for another question related to climate change.
Demand for meat is growing, and that has consequences for human health and the environment. How is science trying to address this problem?
Our hunger for meat contributes in a major way to climate change and environmental degradation. And the conditions in which billions of animals are kept also poses a direct health threat to humanity, since experts say intensive animal agriculture provides a nearly perfect breeding ground for pathogens to evolve. But people aren't going to want to start eating less meat from one day to the next. Demand for it is actually growing at a dizzying pace. So what's science doing to help improve the paradigm? Well, two things jump instantly to mind. One is all that research behind plant-based meat alternatives that look and taste like the real thing, but are mostly made from ingredients like soy or peas or mushrooms. Discoveries in a range of scientific fields, especially those that involve how we process taste and texture, are improving the experience of eating those products, which is reflected by a recent big boom in demand. The other science-driven approach to the meat problem involves the cutting-edge field of cultivated or cultured meat. It's based on the fact that animals themselves are actually pretty inefficient meat factories. Lots of what you put in comes back out again as problematic waste, or it goes towards creating unwanted byproducts like skin or bone. So why not just grow only what you want, the meat, directly from the right types of cells, replicated in giant bioreactors? The science behind doing that in a commercially viable way has actually proven pretty finicky. Maybe you remember the hype around the first lab-grown burger back in 2013, which cost 250,000 euros to make. But the technology has come a long way since then, and production costs are coming down fast. Cultured chicken nuggets were sold commercially for the first time in January in Singapore. Many analysts predict we'll see cleaner, greener, antibiotic-free cultured meat on store shelves in the next few years. The big question, of course, is how willing people will be to buy it.
Our own science expert, Derek Williams there. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.